They left her in a frozen house with no food and called it mercy. The wind that week in northern Montana did not howl. It carved, slicing across the open timberland at nearly 40 miles per hour and driving the temperature down to 20 below. Cold enough to freeze a bucket of water solid before sunrise. Cold enough to make a healthy man question his faith. And in that weather, Clara Whitmore stood alone on the porch of the cabin that no longer belonged to her, watching the last wagon disappear beyond the ridge line as the sky turned the hard color of iron. She was 24, small-framed, raised proper, taught that marriage meant protection and that family meant shelter, and she believed those things right up until the moment her late husband's brothers nailed the feed shed shut and told her there would be no more rations wasted on a widow who brought no income through the winter. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply calculated the pounds of flour left in the barrel and the weeks until spring thaw and decided she did not fit inside the numbers. By the time the first heavy snow came, she had burned through the last of the split pines stacked behind the house, feeding the stove one careful log at a time, stretching heat the way a careful woman stretches dough, thin and thinner still. On the third morning without bread, she wrapped a worn wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside into a world buried under nearly 3 feet of white. The silence so complete it rang in her ears, her breath turning to frost in front of her lips as she walked toward the tree line. Telling herself she would gather fallen branches. Telling herself she would find something. Because decent people did not simply vanish in winter, not in America. Not in a county with a church and a general store and men who claimed to know right from wrong. A mile deeper into the timber, beyond the last fence post anyone bothered to mend, Elias Boone worked alone, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that had not changed in 10 years. 6 feet 3 inches of quiet strength wrapped in wool and leather. A man who had not sat at a supper table with company since the year his own cabin burned, and the town decided grief was better handled at a distance. He measured his life in cords of wood and gallons of lamp oil, spoke only when necessary, and trusted the honesty of trees more than the kindness of neighbors. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in pale gold, his mule halted mid-trail, ears forward, refusing to take another step, and Elias followed the animal's gaze to something out of place along the drifted bank of the creek, a scrap of faded blue fabric half swallowed by ice and wind. He stood still for a long moment, listening to the quiet, feeling that subtle shift a man feels when the ordinary tilts toward something else, and then he moved toward the cloth, unaware that beneath the snow lay not just a body fighting to stay warm, but a decision that would thaw more than one frozen life before winter was done. The scrap of blue cloth did not move when Elias brushed the snow away, and for one steady breath he thought he had arrived too late. But then he saw the faint rise beneath the drift, slow and shallow, the fragile proof that winter had not yet claimed what the town had discarded. He knelt without ceremony, setting his gloves aside and clearing the packed snow with deliberate hands, uncovering a pale face framed by frost-stiffened hair, eyes closed, lashes rimmed in ice crystals that caught the last light of day. Clara Whitmore did not hear him at first. The world had narrowed to the sound of her own breathing and the dull ache of cold that had settled deep into her bones. Elias did not ask who she was or how she came to be a mile beyond any proper road in weather that kept most men indoors. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and another beneath her knees, surprised at how little she weighed, surprised at how fiercely his chest tightened at the thought of leaving her there. The mule shifted behind him, impatient, but did not protest when he secured the sled rope and laid her across the rough wooden boards lined with cut pine boughs. The sky dimmed fast, as it does in January, and by the time he reached his cabin the temperature had fallen another few degrees, the air so sharp it burned the inside of his lungs. He pushed through the door with his shoulder, carried her to the narrow bed against the far wall, and fed 3 fresh logs into the cast iron stove until the small room filled with the steady orange glow of flame. He worked without hurry yet without hesitation, removing her snow-soaked boots, wrapping her in 2 heavy quilts that still smelled faintly of cedar, setting a kettle over the fire until the water whispered against the metal. Outside, the forest returned to its deep winter silence, branches bowing under weight, the creek locked in ice. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of pine and the slow, careful rhythm of a man who had once promised himself he would never again invite complication beneath his roof. Clara stirred as warmth crept back into her hands, her fingers twitching against the coarse wool blanket. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the ceiling beam darkened by years of smoke, and then the outline of a broad-shouldered figure seated several feet away, hat resting on his knee, gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her. She drew in a thin breath, uncertain whether she had been found or captured or merely dreamed of rescue. And Elias rose only long enough to hand her a tin cup filled with warm water, his voice low and even when he spoke. "You are safe here." It was not a promise made lightly, and it was not spoken for comfort alone. It was a statement of fact, the kind that did not require embellishment. Clara's hands trembled as she held the cup, but she did not look away from him this time. And in the quiet space between them, something shifted that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a choice neither of them had expected to make before the sun went down. Morning came slowly to the cabin, not with sunlight, but with a thinning of darkness, the kind that seeps through frost-coated windows and paints the room in pale gray. Elias had not slept. He sat in the same wooden chair beside the stove, adding a split log every hour, measuring the night by the soft collapse of embers. Clara drifted in and out of shallow rest, her breathing steadier now, the harsh tremor gone from her hands. When she fully woke, the fire was already strong and a simple iron skillet rested on the stove, heating cornmeal into a thick, plain mush that smelled faintly sweet against the clean bite of pine smoke. She pushed herself upright slowly, wincing not from injury but from the deep ache that follows long cold, and studied the room with clearer eyes. The cabin was modest, one main space no more than 20 feet across, stacked firewood lining the far wall, a rough table near the window, 2 tin plates set out though only one had been used in years. Elias noticed her gaze linger there, but said nothing. He poured warm water into a basin and placed it on the table without comment, offering privacy in the only way a solitary man knew how. Clara washed her face, the simple act bringing color back into her cheeks, and when she finally spoke her voice was thin but steady. "My name is Clara Whitmore." Elias nodded once, as if storing the information carefully, then answered in the same, even tone. "Elias Boone." No questions followed. He did not ask why she had been alone in the timber. He did not ask who had turned her out. But Clara saw in his eyes that he already understood enough. After they ate in quiet, she rose and moved toward the window, brushing aside the frost with her fingertips. The world outside was still buried, the snowfield unbroken except for the sled tracks leading to the door. She watched the wind carry loose powder across the surface in soft waves, and something inside her steadied. "I will leave once the road's clear," she said, not looking back at him. "I will not trouble you." Elias stood, crossed the room in 2 measured steps, and set another log into the stove. "Trouble is loud," he said after a moment. "You are not." The words settled between them, simple and unadorned, but heavy with meaning. Clara lowered herself into the chair near the fire and wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Outside, a crow called from a distant tree, the only sound in miles. The forest did not care who had been cast out or who had been found. It only held what endured. And inside that small cabin, in the quiet warmth built 1 log at a time, 2 lives that had been shrinking began, almost imperceptibly, to make room for something larger than survival. By the 4th day the storm had settled into a steady fall, no longer raging but persistent, laying down another quiet inch every few hours as if the sky had decided patience would finish what fury began. Clara moved carefully through the cabin that morning, her strength returning in small measures, folding the quilts she had used and sweeping melted snow from the plank floor with a short bristled broom she found behind the door. Elias watched without interfering, splitting kindling just outside beneath the narrow overhang, his axe striking the log block in a rhythm that echoed steady and sure across the clearing. He did not ask her to work, and she did not ask permission. It was an understanding built from silence. Around noon he returned with his arms full of wood and paused when he saw the table cleared, the tin plates washed and drying near the stove. The cabin felt different, not larger but less hollow, as though sound itself had found something to lean against. Clara stood near the window again, studying the line of trees that marked the edge of the property. They will come looking once the snow lets up, she said quietly, her voice no longer trembling. Elias set the wood down and brushed sawdust from his sleeves. For you, he asked. She nodded. My husband's brothers do not like loose ends. The words carried no anger, only a tired certainty. Elias stepped to the door and looked out over the white expanse, measuring distance the way a woodsman does, noting the slope of the ridge, the narrow pass where sled runners could move if someone knew the trail. Let them walk, he said after a moment. The snow is deep and the road is long. Clara turned to face him fully then, searching his expression for fear or hesitation, but found neither. Instead, she saw something steady, something rooted deeper than weather or rumor. That afternoon, she offered to mend a tear in his wool coat, the sleeve ripped from years of labor, and he handed it to her without comment. She worked near the fire, needle flashing in the warm light, the small domestic sound of thread pulling through cloth soft but persistent. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his axe with slow, even strokes, steel against stone, two people repairing what had been worn thin. As evening approached, the sky cleared for the first time in days, revealing a hard, bright blue that promised a colder night ahead. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, no wind to bend it. Clara stepped outside briefly, wrapped in the coat she had just mended, and looked at the untouched snow stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those trees stood a house that had turned her away. Somewhere beyond that, a town that had not asked questions. She drew in a breath that no longer burned and felt the weight of choice settling in her chest. Inside the cabin, Elias added another log to the fire and left the door unlatched, not as an invitation, not as a challenge, but as a quiet declaration that whatever came down that trail would find more than a frightened widow waiting alone. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, the kind of cold that tightens wood and makes every footstep on snow sound like a snapped twig. Elias rose before first light as he always did, pulling on his mended coat and stepping outside to split a new stack of logs, each swing of the axe sending a clean crack through the still air. Clara watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping back inside to stir the coals and set water to warm, her movements steady now, no longer tentative. The cabin had settled into a rhythm that felt almost practiced, as though two strangers had been living side by side for months instead of days. Around mid-morning, as the sun climbed high enough to cast long silver shadows across the clearing, a faint sound drifted through the trees, distant but distinct, the crunch of sled runners over packed snow. Elias paused mid-swing, listening, the axe resting against his shoulder. Clara stepped beside him on the porch, her hand tightening slightly around the door frame, not in fear, but in recognition. Two figures emerged along the narrow trail that cut through the timber, bundled in heavy coats, their sled drawn by a pair of tired horses. Even at a distance, Clara knew the set of their shoulders. Elias did not step back inside. He planted the axe head into the stump and folded his arms across his chest, not confrontational, simply present. When the men stopped at the edge of the clearing, the silence between them felt wider than the snowfield itself. One of them cleared his throat and spoke Clara's name, not kindly, not cruelly, just as though calling for something misplaced. Clara moved forward until she stood level with Elias, the cold air biting at her cheeks, but no longer stealing her breath. I am here, she answered, her voice carrying clean across the yard. The men exchanged a look, surprise flickering briefly before it hardened into something more practical. They spoke of property and obligation, of family duty and winter provisions, words that sounded reasonable when arranged carefully. Elias listened without interruption, his gaze steady, offering no argument and no invitation. When they finished, he glanced once at Clara, giving her space to choose her own reply. I was not lost, she said evenly. I was left. The words settled into the cold like stones dropped in clear water. No shouting followed. No threats were made. The wind shifted slightly, carrying smoke from the cabin chimney in a straight, thin line toward the trees. The men looked past Elias at the stacked wood, at the smoke, at Clara standing upright and unafraid. Something in the arithmetic changed. After a long pause, one of them nodded stiffly and tugged the reins. The horses turned with visible relief, sled runners carving new lines back toward the trail. Elias remained still until the figures disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did he pick up the axe again. Clara exhaled slowly, watching the clearing return to quiet. The snow held every mark of the encounter, but inside the cabin the fire burned as steady as before, and for the first time since winter began, Clara felt that the ground beneath her feet belonged to her choice rather than someone else's calculation. After the sled tracks faded beneath a fresh dusting of snow, the clearing felt larger, as if the forest itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next. Elias resumed his work with the axe, but the rhythm had changed, no longer only the steady measure of survival, but something steadier still, something chosen. Clara remained on the porch a while longer, her gaze following the line where the men had disappeared, not with regret, but with a quiet reckoning. The sun hung pale and distant, offering light without warmth, and the air held that dry metallic scent that comes when temperatures hover near 10 degrees above zero. Inside, the cabin stove glowed strong, iron ticking softly as it settled. By afternoon, Clara had taken stock of the shelves and the small pantry Elias kept with careful order. There were sacks of beans, dried apples wrapped in cloth, smoked venison hanging from a beam, and enough flour to carry one person through to March if measured with discipline. She counted silently, not out of worry but out of habit, a skill learned from years of stretching meals thin. When Elias stepped back in, stamping snow from his boots, he noticed the neat rows she had arranged and the small ledger she had found tucked beneath a tin cup. "I can make this last longer," she said, not as a question but as an offering. He regarded her for a moment, then nodded once. That evening they shared a simple stew, steam rising in slow curls between them, and for the first time Elias set a second plate without hesitation. The cabin no longer echoed when a spoon touched tin. Outside, twilight settled early, painting the snow in shades of blue that deepened by the minute. Clara sat near the fire with the mended coat across her lap, reinforcing the seams with careful stitches, each pull of thread deliberate and sure. Elias sharpened tools at the table, but his eyes lifted now and then, not in suspicion, not in doubt, simply acknowledging the presence across from him. The world beyond the trees remained unchanged, a town that had calculated worth in pounds of flour and square feet of shelter, but within these rough-cut walls a different arithmetic had begun. Days passed in this quiet partnership. They hauled water from the creek by cutting a careful hole through the ice, measured at 8 inches thick enough to hold a man's weight without complaint. They stacked wood higher along the outer wall, preparing for the next storm forecast by the shape of clouds rolling low from the west. Clara moved with growing strength, her steps firm on the packed snow, her breath no longer fragile in the cold. One evening, as the sky flared briefly in a wash of pink before surrendering to night, she stood beside Elias at the edge of the clearing and looked out over the untouched drifts. "I thought winter meant ending," she said softly. Elias considered the horizon, the long line of dark timber standing against the fading light. "Winter only shows what is built to last," he replied. The words were simple, carried on a thin ribbon of breath into the cold air, yet they settled deep, as solid as the cabin beams above them. And in that clearing, where silence once pressed heavy and alone, two figures stood side by side, not bound by obligation, not claimed by ownership, but joined by a choice made when the snow was deepest and the world had turned its back. By the second week after the visit, word had begun to travel the way it always does in small counties, not in loud declarations, but in careful retellings at the general store and the church steps, each version trimmed and reshaped until it fit the teller's comfort. A widow who had been turned out, a lumberjack who had taken her in. No one mentioned the flour barrels or the locked shed anymore. They spoke instead of propriety and appearances, of what seemed proper on paper. Clara felt the shift even before another sled appeared on the trail. It was there in the way a hawk circled low one afternoon, and in the way Elias paused longer at the tree line, listening. 3 days after the first visit, just past noon, a different pair of men approached the clearing, dressed in heavier coats, their collars turned high against a wind that carried fine crystals of snow across the surface like drifting sand. They did not call out her name this time. They called his. "Mr. Boone." The tone was measured, official without being declared so. Elias stepped forward from the woodpile, wiping his hands on a cloth, his posture straight but unarmed, the axe resting back in its place by the stump. Clara stood just inside the doorway, visible but not hidden, her shoulders squared. The men spoke of concern, of how a woman's reputation could suffer in isolation, of how the town might misunderstand what it did not see. Their words were smooth, shaped by habit, the kind of speech that believes itself reasonable. Elias listened, his eyes steady as winter sky. When they finished, he did not argue. He simply turned slightly toward Clara and asked, "Do you wish to leave?" The question hung in the cold air, clean and unclouded. Clara stepped forward. Onto the porch, the boards creaking lightly beneath her boots. "I wish to remain where I am respected," she said, her voice clear enough to carry beyond the clearing. The men shifted, glancing at one another as if recalculating a sum that refused to balance. Respect was harder to measure than flour, harder to confiscate. The wind picked up, tugging at coat hems and sending a thin line of smoke from the chimney straight upward into the pale sky. After a long silence, one of the men removed his gloves and tucked them into his pocket, as though conceding something without naming it. "We only came to see," he said finally. "Then see," Clara answered, gesturing to the stacked wood, the cleared path, the steady column of smoke. "See that I am not starving. See that I am not afraid." Elias said nothing more. He did not need to. The men lingered only a moment longer before turning their sled back toward town, their runners whispering over the crusted snow. When the sound faded, the clearing felt still again, but different, not isolated, chosen. Clara stepped down from the porch and joined Elias beside the woodpile. For the first time since winter began, the silence between them was not heavy with survival, but anchored in shared ground. Beyond the trees, the town could measure what it pleased. Out here, in the cold, bright light, respect had already drawn its line. By late February, the snow had hardened into layers. 3 distinct storms pressed into one another like pages in a closed book, the top crust strong enough to hold a man for 2 or 3 careful steps before giving way. The days stretched a little longer now, light lingering past 5 in the evening, and with it came a quiet restlessness that even the forest could not hide. Clara felt it first when she noticed the sacks in the pantry were lower than they should have been. Not empty, not alarming, but reduced in a way that did not match their careful ledger. She did not accuse. She simply counted again, running her fingers along the folded edges of cloth, measuring by memory and weight. Elias watched her from across the room, reading the faint crease in her brow the way he read storm signs in the sky. That afternoon, he followed the sled path down toward the lower ridge, where the trail met the main road to town, his boots pressing deep into the crust, his breath steady in the thin cold air. Near the bend where pine gave way to open field, he found what he expected and what he had hoped not to see. Fresh tracks beside his own, lighter boots, smaller, circling the wood stack he kept covered near the tree line. No doors had been forced, no windows broken, just quiet subtraction. He stood there a long moment, hat low over his eyes, considering. Back at the cabin, Clara had already made her decision. When Elias returned, she was tying a length of twine around a small bundle of dried apples and cornmeal wrapped in cloth. "They are hungry," she said simply, not looking up. He set his gloves on the table and met her gaze. "They left you hungry." Clara held his eyes without flinching. Yes. The word hung between them, not sharp, not bitter, just true. Elias stepped to the door and looked out across the white clearing that had become their shared ground. "Hunger does not end because pride demands it," he said quietly. The next morning they loaded the sled with 2 modest sacks, nothing that would endanger their own stores, but enough to matter, and Clara placed the bundle she had tied on top, securing it with careful knots. They did not send a note. They did not ask for thanks. Elias drove the mule down the narrow pass before sunrise, leaving the supplies at the edge of the property that had once shut its doors to her, setting them where they would be found without spectacle. By the time the town woke, the sled tracks were already fading under a thin veil of new snow. Back at the cabin, Clara stood beside the window as Elias returned, the morning light reflecting off the drifts in soft gold. He did not speak of what he had done. She did not ask. Outside, the forest remained indifferent, but something had shifted again, not in volume, but in weight. The arithmetic had changed once more. What had been taken in fear was returned in quiet strength, and in the steady glow of the stove that evening, it was clear that winter had begun to loosen its grip, not because the temperature had risen, but because mercy had found its way across the snow. March arrived not with warmth but with sound, the slow drip from the cabin roof at midday, the subtle crack of ice loosening its hold along the creek, the forest shifting in tones too soft for town men to notice. Clara stood outside one morning with her face lifted toward the pale sun, feeling something other than cold on her skin for the first time in weeks. The air hovered just above 30 degrees, enough to soften the top layer of snow into a damp crust that clung to boots and carried the scent of thawing earth beneath. Elias worked near the woodpile, splitting only what was needed now, no longer building walls of stacked timber against endless storms, but trimming the reserve with measured confidence. The season was turning. With it, so was the town. 2 days after the supplies had been left in quiet along the lower ridge, a single rider appeared near dusk, not cautious like the others, not official, just uncertain. It was the younger of the brothers, shoulders bent under more than his coat. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and removed his hat, holding it against his chest as though entering a church. Clara stepped forward before Elias could move, the packed snow crunching beneath her boots. The man spoke without meeting her eyes. He said the sacks had been found. He said the dried apples had been shared at their table. He said nothing about apology at first, only about surprise. Clara listened without interruption, her hands folded loosely in front of her apron. When he finally looked up, there was something unguarded in his expression, something stripped down by hunger and reflection. "We misjudged," he said quietly. "Not only the winter." The words seemed small against the wide clearing, but they did not fall flat. Elias stood a few steps behind her, silent as ever, allowing the moment to belong where it should. Clara did not step closer, did not step back. "I was not mismeasured," she replied. "I was dismissed. The difference matters." The man nodded slowly, as though understanding had taken time to travel the distance between pride and truth. He spoke then of town talk, of how people had begun to question what had happened when they saw that she had not perished in the snow. How the story had shifted from assumption to discomfort. How some had started to see the arithmetic differently. The creek behind the cabin groaned softly as ice split and drifted apart, the sound low and certain. Clara felt the season in that noise, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. "You do not owe me anything," she said at last. "But you owe yourselves better." The man replaced his hat and nodded once more, a gesture heavier than words, before turning his horse back toward the road. As twilight settled across the clearing, Elias stepped beside Clara, his presence steady at her shoulder. The town had begun to thaw in its own way, not from heat, but from reflection. And in the fading light, with meltwater tracing thin silver lines through the snow, it was clear that what had been abandoned in winter had returned stronger than any of them had expected. By the time April edged across the valley, the snow had retreated in uneven patches, revealing dark soil beneath, like ink seeping through paper. The creek ran free now, water moving fast, and clear over stones that had not seen daylight in months. Clara walked its bank one morning, her boots sinking slightly into the thawing ground, listening to the current as if it were carrying news from somewhere far beyond the trees. Elias was repairing the fence line near the lower ridge, replacing posts that had warped under winter's pressure, his movements measured and unhurried. The land did not rush its healing, and neither did he. Word from town had shifted again. What began as whispers had turned into invitations, subtle at first. A note left at the edge of the property, weighted under a smooth river stone, written in careful script from the pastor's wife, asking after Clara's health and mentioning that the church pantry would welcome extra hands come planting season. Another message followed 2 days later, this one from the general store, stating that fabric shipments were expected by mid-May and skilled seamstresses were rare in early spring. Clara read each note at the rough wooden table inside the cabin, smoothing the paper with thoughtful fingers. Elias did not press her for a decision. He understood that returning on her own terms required more strength than leaving ever had. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the clearing in amber light, Clara stepped onto the porch and watched Elias stack the last of the split rails. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine sap, no longer sharp with frost, but heavy with possibility. "I will go into town next week," she said, not seeking approval, only stating intent. Elias leaned the final rail into place and met her eyes. "Will you return?" he asked. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. the kind that measures not distance but direction. Yes, she answered. This is my ground now. The words settled between them, steady and unadorned. The following Tuesday, with the sky clear and the road passable, Elias harnessed the mule and drove the sled toward town, Clara seated beside him, her back straight, her expression calm. They entered not as rumor but as fact, the runners whispering over packed dirt instead of snow. Heads turned, conversations paused, but no one stepped forward with accusation. Instead there were nods, small gestures of acknowledgement, and space made along the boardwalk. Clara stepped down from the sled and walked toward the general store, each footfall firm, the bell above the door ringing bright as she entered. Elias remained outside, hat low, giving her the room to stand on her own. The town watched quietly, perhaps expecting resentment, perhaps bracing for reckoning. What they saw instead was composure. What they felt was something deeper than guilt. It was the understanding that dignity, once denied, does not disappear. It waits, and when it returns, it does so without shouting, without spectacle, carrying with it a strength no winter can bury. The bell above the general store door had rung once when Clara entered, but by the time she stepped back onto the boardwalk an hour later, it felt as though the whole street had been listening. Bolts of fabric rested over her arm, modest lengths of calico and sturdy cotton, nothing extravagant, just enough to begin again. The storekeeper had spoken carefully, not with pity but with respect, measuring his words the way he measured cloth, straight and even. Outside, Elias waited beside the sled, hat low against the afternoon sun, his posture easy but alert. When Clara approached, several townsfolk offered small nods, the kind that admit awareness without demanding conversation. No one blocked her path. No one asked her to explain. The silence held a different weight now. By the following week, a small sign appeared in the front window of a vacant corner space near the post office, hand-painted in simple black letters. Alterations and mending by Clara Whitmore. The paint was still drying when the pastor's wife stepped inside with a stack of worn shirts and a quiet smile. Work began slowly, one hem at a time, one seam reinforced, one coat lining replaced. Clara's hands moved with the same steady patience she had learned in the cabin, each stitch deliberate, each thread drawn tight with purpose. She did not speak of winter. She did not recount who had left her without food. She simply worked. Elias returned to the timber most days, hauling logs down the ridge and delivering cut wood to homes that had once calculated worth in narrow terms. He charged the same fair price he always had, neither raising it for pride nor lowering it for approval. When he passed along the boardwalk, conversations no longer paused. They adjusted. There was space made where there had once been distance. One afternoon, as the snow finally vanished from the last shaded ditch and the air carried the faint scent of early grass, the two brothers approached Clara's shop together. They removed their hats before stepping inside. The room was small, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor, dust motes turning lazily in the beam. Clara looked up from her sewing table, needle poised midair. "We came to settle accounts," one of them said, placing a folded envelope on the counter. "Not payment for charity, payment for error." Clara did not open it immediately. She studied their faces, searching not for remorse performed but for understanding earned. Outside, Elias stood across the street with a load of split pine stacked high in the wagon, watching without intrusion. After a moment, Clara nodded once and set the envelope aside. "Then we begin fresh," she said. "No debt forward, no debt back." The brothers agreed with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than apology alone. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the town did not erupt in applause. It did not need to. The change was visible in smaller ways. In the way neighbors lingered to talk, in the way orders filled Clara's table faster than she could have predicted. That evening, as the sky turned soft gold over the valley and the creek ran clear beyond the ridge, Elias walked Clara back to the cabin, not because she required escort, but because shared ground had become a habit neither wished to break. And in the steady rhythm of boots against dry earth, it was clear that what had once been measured in scarcity was now measured in something steadier, something earned without force and kept without fear. Late spring settled over the valley with a softness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the land itself was cautious after months of severity. Grass pushed through the dark soil in thin green blades. and the air carried the steady hum of thawed earth waking under longer days. Clara's shop window stood open most afternoons now, sunlight pouring across her work table where folded fabric waited in neat stacks. The sound of her needle moving through cloth blended with the distant rhythm of hammers and wagon wheels along the main road. Business had grown beyond simple mending. Brides from neighboring farms brought modest white dresses for alteration, ranch hands requested reinforced seams before summer drives, and even the pastor stopped by with a worn coat that needed careful lining. Clara worked with calm precision, never rushing, never boasting. She charged fair rates and returned every garment cleaner than she had received it. Respect, once withheld, now arrived in quiet increments, placed on her counter in folded bills and steady eye contact. Elias continued to divide his time between the timber and the edge of town, hauling lumber for a new barn rising near the church. He spoke little as always, but when he did, men listened without dismissal. The story of winter had shifted entirely. No longer told as gossip, it had become something closer to a lesson that required no sermon. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the ridge and cast long gold streaks across the fields, Clara closed her shop early and walked toward the outskirts where the new barn frame stood against the sky. Elias was securing the final beam, measuring the angle with quiet focus. When he climbed down from the ladder, she handed him a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter of apology, not a receipt, but a deed transfer signed that afternoon. The vacant corner space that held her shop was now fully hers, purchased with the earnings she had built stitch by stitch. Elias read the paper slowly, then looked up at her, something like pride flickering across his otherwise reserved expression. "You built this," he said. Clara nodded once. "With help," she replied, not diminishing herself but acknowledging truth. Around them, the barn stood firm, its beams aligned and secured, a structure that would outlast seasons. The town had contributed labor freely this time, neighbors volunteering without expectation of return. No announcement had been made, no apology publicly proclaimed. Yet in the steady work of raised walls and balanced accounts, a different kind of justice had taken root. As dusk deepened and lanterns flickered to life along the main street, Clara and Elias walked back toward the cabin beyond the ridge, the path no longer marked by snow but by worn earth shaped through shared steps. The winter that once threatened to erase her had become the season that revealed her strength. And in the quiet glow of windows lining the town, it was clear that mercy had not only saved one life, it had reshaped the measure by which an entire community judged its own. Summer arrived without announcement, not in a single blazing day, but in the gradual thickening of grass across the valley and the steady warmth that lingered past 8 in the evening. The creek that had once grown beneath ice now ran smooth and bright, reflecting a sky so wide it seemed to stretch beyond memory. Clara's shop door stood open to the street, lace curtains stirring gently in the breeze, the steady hum of town life passing without tension. Inside, the rhythm of her sewing had become as familiar to the town as the church bell on Sunday morning. Children stopped to watch her work. Ranch wives trusted her with wedding dresses and Sunday coats, and men who once calculated her worth in pounds of flour now tipped their hats without hesitation. She did not speak of what had been done to her. She did not remind them. Her presence was reminder enough. Beyond the ridge, the cabin remained unchanged in its bones but altered in its meaning. The woodpile stood full, not out of fear of winter but out of habit. The fence Elias had repaired in early spring held firm. Enclosing a small garden Clara had planted near the south wall, rows of beans climbing thin stakes, tomatoes ripening in slow red circles under the sun. Evenings found them seated on the porch, the air warm against their skin, listening to crickets rise in chorus as daylight faded. They did not speak much of the past. There was no need to reopen what had already been answered. One Saturday, as the town gathered to celebrate the completion of the new barn near the church, Elias stood among the men who had raised its beams, his hands rough from labor, his posture easy. Clara arrived shortly after, wearing a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, the fabric catching light with quiet dignity. When the pastor offered thanks for neighbors who had stood together through hardship, his gaze moved briefly toward them, not singling them out, but acknowledging something understood by all. No applause followed. None was required. The barn stood tall because many hands had lifted it. The town stood straighter because it had learned to measure differently. As dusk settled, lanterns flickered along the road and laughter carried across open fields. Clara and Elias walked back toward the ridge side by side, their steps unhurried. At the crest, they paused, looking down at the cluster of lights glowing against the darkening valley. Once, that town had turned away from a woman in winter. Now it watched her return each evening not as burden, but as builder. The air was still, warm, filled with the scent of cut hay and distant pine. Elias rested his hand lightly on the porch rail when they reached home, and Clara stood beside him, the cabin door open behind them, lights spilling out onto the path. Winter would come again, as it always does. Snow would fall, temperatures would drop. But there are seasons that reveal a person and seasons that reveal a town. That year, when the cold returned, no one was left outside. And in the quiet glow of a lamp set in a window on the edge of the timber, dignity burned steady, needing no witness, asking for nothing more than to endure.